Hannah had always thought her new home would be a peaceful escape, but from the moment she moved in, something felt off. Strange noises echoed through the walls at night, scraping, thumping, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, she convinced herself it was just the quirks of an old house, but as the sounds grew louder and more unsettling, she began to wonder if something darker was lurking just beyond the wall, something that would change her life forever. Hannah was excited to finally have her own place. After working hard for years, she was able to buy a small house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't big or fancy, but it was hers. The house was cozy, with wooden floors that creaked when she walked, a small kitchen, and a basement she didn't use much. It was the perfect place for someone who liked their own space. For the first few weeks, everything was calm. The neighborhood was peaceful, and the neighbors were friendly but kept to themselves. Hannah didn't mind. She wasn't looking for new friends, just a place to relax and be alone. But there was one neighbor who stood out. Mr. Elwood, the man who lived next door. Mr. Elwood was strange. He was older, with messy grey hair, and always looked a little out of place. His clothes were never quite put together, and he would often stand at his front door, staring at Hannah whenever she came home. At first, she thought it was just curiosity since she was the new neighbor, but his stare made her feel uncomfortable. He never smiled or greeted her like the other neighbors. Instead, it was like he was watching her. Over time, his behavior got even weirder. Sometimes she would hear him pacing back and forth outside at night, mumbling to himself. Other times there would be loud banging noises coming from the wall between their houses. The sounds were so strange, they woke her up in the middle of the night. One evening, when she came home, she saw him standing in his yard, staring at her window. She quickly hurried inside, locking the door behind her. Even though she was uneasy, Hannah tried to tell herself that he was just a little odd, maybe lonely. Everyone had their quirks, but the strange feeling stayed with her. Her new home, which had felt like a peaceful refuge at first, no longer felt safe. The noises from the wall got louder and harder to ignore. At first, Hannah thought it was just the old house settling. Creaky floors and walls that made strange sounds were normal. But soon, she realized the noises were different. They didn't sound random. They were deliberate. One night, as she folded clothes in the basement, she heard it again. A scraping sound followed by a slow thud, thud, thud. The noises came from the shared wall. She stopped what she was doing, holding her breath as she listened carefully. She could even hear soft, mumbling voices, like someone was singing a tune that she couldn't quite make out. It sent a shiver down her spine. Hannah moved closer to the wall, pressing her ear to the cold bricks. On the other side, she could hear footsteps moving around. There was the sound of metal clinking and something being dragged across the floor. It was like Elwood was right there, just on the other side, but the wall made it feel like he was miles away. She quickly stepped back, her heart racing. What was he doing over there at this hour? She couldn't make sense of it. The noises continued every night. The scraping, the thudding, the muffled voices. It was hard to sleep with all the strange sounds filling the silence of the night. The next day, she called her landlord to complain. He laughed it off. "It's just the house," he said. "These old row houses make strange noises. Elwood's been there for years. He's harmless, trust me." But Hannah wasn't convinced. She couldn't ignore what was happening. The sounds weren't normal, and Elwood's strange behavior was only making things worse. One evening, when she was unloading groceries, she saw him standing in his driveway, staring at her car. His eyes didn't move as she carried the bags inside. She quickly rushed inside, locking the door behind her. That night, the noises were worse than ever. It sounded like something heavy was being dragged across the floor, followed by loud bangs. Hannah couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her phone and went down to the basement, determined to record the sounds. But just as she held her phone up to the wall, everything stopped. It was completely silent. She waited for a moment, her heart pounding. Then, just as she was about to put her phone down, she heard it. A whisper. It was so quiet she could barely hear it, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. She stumbled back, unsure of what to do next. The whispers were real, and they weren't coming from her side of the wall. Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The noises, the whisper, and Elwood's increasingly erratic behavior had left her on edge. She had to know what was going on. But how? She couldn't just march over to Elwood's house and confront him. It wasn't that simple. No one would believe her if she claimed there was something sinister behind the wall. She needed proof. Something concrete. Something that would explain the strange occurrences she couldn't ignore any longer. The next evening, after another restless night, filled with the eerie sounds from the basement, Hannah decided to take matters into her own hands. She had to know what was happening on the other side of that wall. Armed with her phone, a flashlight, and a sense of determination, she set off to investigate. Her heart pounded as she descended into the basement, the weight of the silence pressing down on her. The air was thick, stale with the scent of old wood and damp stone. She shone the flashlight along the wall, scanning for any sign of damage, any crack, any indication that something might be wrong. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed something strange. The wall between their basements wasn't uniform. In one corner, the bricks looked slightly out of place, looser, as if they'd been disturbed recently. A chill ran down her spine as she examined it more closely. What was behind this section of the wall? Her fingers trembled as she reached out, brushing against the uneven surface. Then, with a sudden crack, a brick came loose in her hand. Hannah's breath caught in her throat as she slowly pulled the brick away. Behind it was a small, dark hole. She peered inside, her flashlight casting an eerie glow on the hidden space. She could just make out the faint outline of something that didn't belong in her home. She quickly grabbed her phone and started recording, her hands shaking as she captured the strange sight before her. The air inside the hole smelled musty, stale, and as she watched, her stomach churned with a rising sense of dread. Whatever was hidden behind this wall was not something she could ignore. As the days passed, Hannah couldn't stop thinking about what she had discovered in the wall. The hole was too small to fit through, but it was big enough to hold something that might explain all the strange noises and disturbing events that had been happening. She had to confront Elwood. He was the only person who could possibly explain what was going on, but every time she thought about going to him, a wave of fear would wash over her. What if he wasn't just odd? What if he was dangerous? That evening, she gathered her courage and knocked on Elwood's door. She stood there for what felt like an eternity before he finally answered, his eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't greet her. Instead, he just stared, his face frozen in a mask of strange indifference. Hannah could barely keep her voice steady as she asked him about the noises she had been hearing. "I've been hearing things from your side of the wall," she said, trying to sound casual, though her pulse was racing. "Is there something going on over there?" Elwood didn't respond right away. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on her as though weighing her every word. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Don't go looking for things you don't want to find," he warned, his voice carrying a hint of something she couldn't place. Fear, perhaps? Or was it guilt? Hannah felt a chill creep over her. "What's behind the wall, Elwood? I need to know." For a moment, Elwood didn't speak. He simply stared at her, and then, without warning, he reached out, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. "You don't understand. It's not just a wall. It's a barrier. And if you break it, you'll never be the same again." Hannah yanked her arm away, panic flooding her chest. She didn't know what to believe, but she could see the desperation in his eyes. He was hiding something, and it wasn't just a simple explanation. She turned and ran back to her house, her heart racing as she slammed the door behind her. The next few days were a blur of confusion and fear. Elwood's warning haunted her, but she couldn't let it go. She had come too far, and there was no turning back now. She had to know what was behind that wall, what was causing the strange noises and the whispers. She couldn't let Elwood's cryptic words stop her. Late one night, after everyone in the neighborhood had fallen asleep, Hannah made her decision. She returned to the basement, her heart thundering in her chest. The hole in the wall was still there, just as she had left it, and with shaking hands she pulled out the last brick that had been covering it. This time she didn't hesitate. She crawled through the opening, squeezing into the dark, cramped space on the other side. The air in the hidden room was thick with dust, and the walls felt oppressively close. But as she stepped forward, she could see what had been hidden from view all these years. Piles of old furniture, broken objects, and scattered papers filled the room. But that wasn't what made her freeze in horror. What caught her eye was the wall opposite her, covered in strange markings, symbols, runes, and what appeared to be a series of scratched messages. Some of them were written in a language she didn't recognize. Her flashlight flickered as she scanned the room, and that's when she saw it. A door, hidden behind a tangle of old furniture. She pushed the debris aside, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room beyond. And there, in the center of the room, was a small table. Atop it was something she would never be able to forget. A jar filled with strange blackened objects, and a piece of paper with a single word scrawled across it in what looked like blood. Escape. Hannah stumbled back, the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. The wall wasn't just a barrier between two homes, it was a prison. And Elwood wasn't just a strange neighbor, he was a keeper of secrets, and the wall had been hiding something far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. Across from her, on the far side of the room, was another door. It was small, almost like a closet door, but it was locked. Her hands shook as she approached it, her curiosity burning. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out and tried the door handle. To her surprise, it opened easily. Inside was a tiny, dimly lit room. The walls were covered with strange symbols, scratches and markings that Hannah didn't understand. But what caught her attention was the table in the center of the room. On it was a jar filled with dark, blackened objects, and next to the jar was a piece of paper with one word written on it in red ink. Escape. A sudden feeling of dread washed over Hannah. This wasn't just some old, abandoned space. Something terrible had been happening behind these walls, and Elwood had been hiding it all along. The jar, the symbols, the word, it all pointed to something she couldn't fully comprehend, but she knew one thing for sure. Elwood wasn't just a strange neighbor, he was part of something much darker. Hannah's mind raced. She couldn't stay in this room any longer. She turned to leave, but as she did, she heard a faint sound behind her. The door slammed shut with a loud bang, trapping her inside. Panic surged through her as she tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. She was locked in. Suddenly she heard footsteps coming down the stairs. Elwood. She could hear his heavy breathing, the soft shuffle of his feet. He was coming closer. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had to escape. With a burst of strength, she threw herself against the door, the force sending it crashing open. She ran as fast as she could, stumbling through the basement and back into her house. She didn't look back. Hannah didn't sleep that night. She didn't know what Elwood was capable of, but she knew she had to leave. The next morning, she packed her things and moved out of the house. She never went back. The wall, the hidden room, and the jar filled with strange objects remained a mystery, but Hannah knew one thing. Some secrets were better left buried, As she left the neighborhood behind, she couldn't shake the feeling that the wall wasn't just the barrier between two houses. It was the boundary between a normal life and a world of darkness that she was lucky to escape.